If you look at the Confederate Constitution, which was modeled on the United States Constitution, they had a very short time to come up with their government, and so they adopted most of the same things as was already in place in the North. There were only a few things that were different. One, the president could serve for 6 years instead of 4, and states did have the right to secede from the National Union, although they then didn't like it when West Virginia seceded from Virginia. That got into another whole ball of wax. But basically it was that they had the right to own African Americans. That was the bottom line, and that's what they were separating for. I mean, I can't imagine anyone wanted to die just because their president could serve 6 years instead of 4, or that you could secede, no matter how important that was. The way of life, the culture, everything was based upon the slavery issue. Even people who didn't own slaves often aspired to, because it was a sign of wealth. It was property just like anything else. So even a poor dirt farmer thought about one day being able to own slaves in the South, where he could do that. And they felt their way of life was under attack, and they resented the North, and a lot of other factors come in. But basically, it all boils down to slavery being the primary concern and cause.
Jefferson Davis was elected president and quickly issued a call for 100,000 volunteers to serve in the new Confederate Army. Federal arsenals in the new Confederacy were soon raided. One by one, nearly every fort was taken or surrendered to the new Southern nation. Only a few garrisons stubbornly resisted, including the man at Fort Sumter, a fortress that guarded Charleston Harbor. Commanded by Major Robert Anderson, a Southerner who remained loyal to the Union, the federal stronghold stood as an insult to the Confederacy, which meant to obtain it by negotiation or force.
Early in 1861, the federal government dispatches a supply ship, the Star of the West, to Fort Sumter to bring in supplies and reinforcements that are needed by the garrison there. Now, the Confederate forces who are surrounding Fort Sumter fire on the Star of the West and turn it back. And at this point, with that failure of that resupply mission, Fort Sumter becomes the focal point of all Americans as they hold their breath about whether or not there'll be actual conflict.
In spite of the failure of the Star of the West, the federal government resolved to maintain its garrison at Fort Sumter. Calls to surrender were stubbornly refused, and by mid-April, the situation had reached the breaking point.
The Confederates got into a very bad confrontational situation there, and although there were clear-headed people saying, you know, we really shouldn't fire on the federal government because it will put us in the wrong. Despite the fact there were cooler heads, there were a lot of people pushing to have the final match, the final explosion that would finally plunge the country into war, because so many people seemed to want it.
On April 12, 1861, Confederate General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard ordered his guns to open fire on Fort Sumter's garrison. With that first cannonade, the flames of war quickly spread to consume all of America.
The South attacked the North, and the perception in the North was that this put the South in the wrong. They had their rights, yes. They had rights to own slaves. They had rights to even argue that they could secede. But they did not have the right to attack, fire upon the national flag. And that really gave Lincoln the kind of boost he needed politically to rally the North and to get people to volunteer to put down the rebellion.